The air in Geneva that morning was brisk, the sky brushed with silver clouds, and the city buzzed with a kind of polite tension reserved only for global summits. Limousines lined up like chess pieces outside the United Nations Technology and Ethics Forum, an annual event bringing together the most powerful minds in tech, diplomacy, and philosophy. Inside, the room hummed with quiet ambition. Tech founders adjusted their suits, diplomats rehearsed lines, and world leaders glanced at briefing papers one last time. It was not a place where emotions ran high. It was a place of formality. Rules, handshakes, protocols, optics. Sundar Pichai stood near the side of the stage, quietly observing. Dressed in his trademark understated blazer, his presence was soft, yet unmistakable. He had long grown used to rooms like these, not because they were easy, but because he had taught himself to walk through them without letting them swallow his principles. As CEO of Google, he had become one of the most recognized faces in the world of innovation, and paradoxically, one of the most difficult to categorize. He didn't court attention, he didn't dominate conversations, but when he spoke, even heads of state listened. This summit was particularly significant. The world was teetering on the edge of an AI revolution, not just in capability, but in ethics, governance, and responsibility. Governments feared job losses. Human rights groups feared surveillance. Tech companies feared regulation. And somewhere among all of that, Sundar had been invited to speak about the moral compass of artificial intelligence, a subject he had long championed with clarity and restraint. But it wasn't just the summit that drew attention. It was the guest list. For the first time, leaders from multiple nations, including India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, were in attendance. The symbolism was powerful. The son of a humble electrical engineer from Chennai was now going to speak in front of his home country's leader, the most powerful man in Indian politics. As Sundar walked toward the gathering circle of dignitaries, for the pre-session greeting, camera flashes sparked in a half-moon arc, illuminating every facial expression and gesture. The energy thickened. Among the dozen officials stood Prime Minister Modi, flanked by security personnel and aides, speaking in a quiet tone with a foreign envoy. As Sundar approached, not with pomp but with humility, he nodded politely toward the Prime Minister and extended his hand in a respectful, measured gesture. What happened next would echo through the halls of power and across social media, worldwide. Prime Minister Modi looked directly at Sundar. Their eyes locked for half a second, and then, without a word, Modi turned slightly toward another leader beside him, continuing his conversation, leaving Sundar's hand suspended in midair for a split second too long, an absence that didn't go unnoticed. Cameras clicked, eyebrows raised. A few aides looked confused. Sundar, ever calm, lowered his hand with quiet grace and stepped back into position, his face revealing no discomfort, no offense, only understanding. He didn't flinch, he didn't frown. He simply stood still, collected with a kind of poise that few people could maintain under the scrutiny of thousands. To the untrained eye, it could have been a miscommunication. Perhaps the Prime Minister hadn't seen the hand. Perhaps protocol dictated otherwise, but to the world watching, it looked like a deliberate snub, one that could have stirred controversy, bitterness, or even political tension, except that it didn't, because what Sundar did next turned the entire narrative on its head. After the morning sessions ended and reporters swarmed the reception, a young journalist from a European outlet approached him with a pointed question. "Mr. Pichai, were you disappointed when Prime Minister Modi didn't acknowledge your handshake?" There was a pause. All microphones leaned in. Sundar smiled gently, eyes steady, and replied in a voice that carried both warmth and unshakable calm. "Moments don't define relationships. Intentions do, and I've never been in this work to be seen. I'm in it to serve. Leadership isn't about how people treat you in public. It's about how you respond in private. That one sentence was all it took. The clip went viral within hours. People across continents praised his maturity, his restraint, his quiet command of dignity in a moment that would have shaken lesser men. Some called it a masterclass in emotional intelligence. Others saw it as a reminder that ego, even when bruised, need not become a weapon. What very few knew, however, was what was going on inside Sundar that evening. Long after the cameras had turned away, long after the headlines had been written, in the privacy of his hotel room, he sat by the window staring out at the lake. His phone buzzed non-stop, messages of support, praise, media inquiries, commentary, but he ignored most of them. His thoughts weren't on the snub or the applause or the perceptions. His mind was on his roots. He thought of his father, who once spent a month's salary to buy a transistor radio. His mother, who never learned to code but believed her son could build computers. He thought of India, not the nation represented by politics, but by people, students, engineers, mothers, teachers, farmers. He had carried their story on his back for decades. He had carried their hope in rooms where their voices were not heard. And so, when the world saw a man refuse a handshake, Sundar saw something else. He saw a lesson. He saw that respect is not always returned in the way we expect, and that doesn't make it any less necessary to offer. He saw that true influence doesn't need validation. It needs vision. He saw that sometimes the most powerful statements are made not in words, but in the refusal to react. That night, he opened his laptop and began drafting the speech he would deliver the next morning at the summit. A speech not about technology, but about humanity. A speech that would redefine what the world expected from its tech leaders and what it meant to lead with conscience, not just code. And it all began with a silence. Not the silence of a missed handshake, but the silence of a man choosing integrity over indignation. Geneva's morning sky cracked open with a gentle blue that stretched above the glass spires of the United Nations headquarters like a silent promise. Inside the grand auditorium, delegates and thinkers filled the curved rows of seating, their badges glinting under golden lights. The hum of whispered translations echoed through the earpieces of attendees. Diplomats murmured over policy briefs, and tech executives stared into glowing screens that concealed their nervousness. The summit's theme was bold: AI and the future of human ethics. But beneath that banner lay a battlefield of ideas, quietly political, privately controversial, and globally consequential. Sundar Pichai arrived precisely 15 minutes before his scheduled address. He entered without fanfare, accompanied only by a small Google delegation and his personal aide. But the moment he stepped into the space, a shift occurred, not physical, not visible, but palpable. Cameras followed him with precision. Attendees, who had once only seen him in headlines or keynotes, now studied his every expression, wondering if the rumors were true, if he would comment on what had transpired the day before. It was no longer about technology. It was about poise, about what one man would say or not say after being publicly bypassed by one of the most powerful figures in the world. What they didn't know was that Sundar had rewritten his speech just hours before. He hadn't intended to. Originally, it was to be a detailed address on the ethics of machine learning, the challenge of algorithmic bias, and the future of global digital policy. But as he sat in his hotel room the night before, with headlines swirling around phrases like "Sundar snubbed" and "Handshake sparks global buzz," he realized that the summit needed something deeper than technical analysis. It needed a human reckoning. When Sundar took the stage, he didn't begin with notes. He stood behind the podium, paused, looked out at the sea of watching eyes, and let silence settle across the room like morning fog. Then he spoke. Not in the calculated cadence of a CEO performing for applause, but with the calm truthfulness of the man who had outgrown the need for approval. "There's a quote I've carried with me for years," he began. "It's from my mother, who once said, 'The measure of your character isn't how loudly you speak, but how gracefully you endure silence.'" A quiet stillness enveloped the audience. "Yesterday," he continued, "a lot of attention was drawn to a moment that didn't go as expected, a gesture, a pause, a silence, and I've been asked repeatedly, was I offended? Was I embarrassed? Was it intentional? But here's what I believe. Our job as leaders is not to analyze every gesture through the lens of ego. Our job is to ask, what can we do together that leaves the world better than we found it?" He looked slowly across the crowd, letting each word settle into the room's foundations. "We are gathered here to talk about artificial intelligence, how it shapes jobs, power, governance. But the deeper truth is this: before we teach machines to be fair, we must teach ourselves. Before we worry about whether robots are ethical, we must ask, are we?" Soft murmurs rippled through the crowd. Delegates leaned forward. Heads of state exchanged glances. "AI won't betray us because it's artificial," he said. "It will betray us if it reflects our worst biases, our worst divisions, our worst silences. If we do not model empathy, our machines will not learn it. If we do not teach nuance, they will encode prejudice. If we treat respect as a transaction rather than a principle, we risk automating injustice on a global scale." He paused for a beat. "I am the son of an electrical engineer who spent 20 years saving for our first rotary phone. I am a citizen of a global company, but I was raised in a home that taught me dignity comes before dialogue. And if someone does not shake your hand, it does not mean you have failed. It means you now have an opportunity to show who you are when no one is watching." The room was utterly still. Even the translators had slowed their voices. This summit is not about who got the microphone. It is about who listens after it's turned off. It's about whether we leave here with principles or just more products. It's about whether we remember that the greatest algorithms in the world are still useless if we forget the humanity they serve. By the time he finished, the silence in the room was no longer tense. It was reverent. Sundar stepped down from the stage without waiting for applause. But the room erupted anyway, not in noisy celebration, but in something deeper. Acknowledgement. People stood. Some clapped softly, some simply nodded, their faces unreadable but stirred. And in the back of the room, behind layers of protocol and security, Prime Minister Modi sat still. His face, for the first time in public that week, showed no performance, only stillness. The moment was not about apologies. It was not about reconciliation. It was about revelation. One man standing in the crossfire of media drama, cultural pride and political spectacle, and choosing to respond with neither retaliation nor retreat, but reflection. Later that evening, as Sundar prepared to leave the venue, a security detail handed him a sealed note. No name, no emblem, just a single line, handwritten in blue ink on cream paper. "The loudest voices often make the smallest impact. Today, you reminded us of the opposite. NM." He folded the note without reaction and placed it into his inside jacket pocket. It wasn't closure, it wasn't public, but it was something more powerful than headlines. It was recognition without vanity. It was grace returned. In the days that followed, global media turned its attention toward the speech, not because it was explosive, but because it was the opposite. Editorials praised its restraint, business leaders quoted its message, college students shared clips, writing captions like, "This is the kind of leader I want to be." Even critics, who had long dismissed Sundar as too soft-spoken for politics, began to rethink what real power sounded like. But for Sundar, none of that mattered as much as one quiet email he received a week later from a 15-year-old girl in Hyderabad who had watched the speech on YouTube. Sir, I used to think leadership meant shouting louder than others. But after watching you, I think leadership means standing tall even when you're left out. Thank you for showing us how to be strong without being angry. He read the message twice, then bookmarked it, because in that line he saw the ripple effect of a single decision, not to retaliate, not to defend, but to respond with truth. That, he knew, was the true purpose of leadership, not to win applause, but to plant principles, even in silence. In the modern world, no moment lives in isolation, especially not one that carries the weight of symbolism, silence, and power. Within hours of Sundar Pichai's poised response at the Geneva summit, what had begun as an awkward public gesture, his extended hand, left hanging by Prime Minister Modi, had erupted into a full-blown global phenomenon. His subsequent speech, elegant in its restraint, had spread not like wildfire but like a quiet wave, cresting across digital spaces, editorial columns, boardroom discussions, and late-night living room conversations. The footage of the handshake moment had already been sliced, captioned, and reinterpreted from every angle. On Twitter, it was dissected by political commentators and digital activists who debated whether Modi's action was a diplomatic slight or a misunderstood lapse. On Instagram and YouTube, Sundar's speech clips, especially his line about dignity, not needing validation, went viral with millions of views and captions like "class over conflict" and "true leadership in action." Even late-night talk shows in the West played the footage, treating the moment with a mix of awe and curiosity. But the storm wasn't just online. It had reached classrooms, corporations, ministries, and kitchen tables. In India, the reactions were polarized. Major national newspapers took cautious tones. Some called Sundar's conduct a masterclass in composure, while others subtly implied that the Prime Minister's decision may have been deliberate, crafted for political theatre, an assertion that the leader of the world's largest democracy didn't need to validate tech billionaires, regardless of their heritage. In contrast, others took the opposite stance, declaring Sundar a true Indian icon, a man whose humility had transcended political optics. They printed full-page features titled "The CEO Who Bowed Without Bending." On television panels, experts battled over what the moment really meant. Sociologists argued that India had always struggled with how it treated its own heroes abroad. Psychologists called it an ego struggle between institutional power and personal success. Political commentators weighed in with rhetoric, connecting the handshake, or lack thereof, to past diplomatic maneuvers, caste dynamics, and national pride. The truth, however, was far simpler and more elusive. It wasn't about the handshake at all. It was about what the world saw in it. And yet, for Sundar, the noise outside was little more than a passing storm. He had already made peace with the moment. The world's interpretation of that silence was not his burden to carry. What he hadn't anticipated, however, was how deeply his speech had impacted a certain corner of society he hadn't thought would be listening. Students, especially those from low-income backgrounds, aspiring entrepreneurs, and young people caught between the hunger to rise and the fear of being misunderstood. Across campuses in India, from Delhi to Coimbatore, debates erupted in student circles, not just about politics or business, but about what it means to be respected. Was respect earned, granted, inherited, demanded? Sundar's story challenged everything they had assumed about power. It wasn't loud, it didn't push. It invited reflection. One such student was Meera. Yes, the same Meera whose story we've followed before. Now, in her final year at San Jose City College, she had been following Sundar's speech from her small student residence. She watched the viral clip on her phone after a full day of teaching coding to underserved youth at her community tech hub. As the screen lit up with his words, "Leadership is how you respond in silence," she froze. Something inside her stirred, not as a fan or admirer, but as a peer in the quiet art of endurance. She remembered her own moments of being dismissed, how people had looked past her, spoken over her, denied her presence. She remembered professors who called her brave instead of brilliant, as if survival was her only achievement. And in Sundar's calm defiance, she saw the reflection of a truth she had lived, that when people ignore you, what matters most is what you do next. Inspired. Meera wrote a public piece on her blog titled, "Not Every Response Needs a Sound." It was written simply, without flourish, and shared only with her small network. But within a week, it was picked up by an online magazine in India focused on youth activism and education. The essay opened with her story, but quickly turned its focus to Sundar's Geneva moment. We live in a time where every slight, every insult, every misstep demands a reply, a tweet, a confrontation. But what Sundar Pichai taught us, without preaching, is that silence is not surrender. Sometimes it's resistance, sometimes it's leadership, sometimes it's a mirror held up to the world. The post went viral, not in the frenzied way gossip does, but in the deliberate, thoughtful way truths travel when they hit the right nerve. Students in universities began sharing it under the hashtag #silent strength. Teachers read it aloud in ethics classes. Mentors forwarded it to mentees. One school in Pune held an entire morning assembly discussing the essay and showing the Geneva speech to 10th graders. And slowly, the narrative began to change. Not just about the handshake, but about what kind of leader people wanted to be. The focus shifted from what was done to Sundar to what Sundar had done with it. The conversation moved from optics to essence, but with visibility also came skepticism. Online trolls questioned whether the moment was staged for drama. Conspiracy theorists created side-by-side videos comparing gestures at previous summits, dissecting Modi's body language. Critics accused Sundar of capitalizing on a public moment to earn sympathy or build global clout. But these voices, though loud, were hollow. Because the power of the moment didn't come from a calculated reaction, it came from the absence of one. Meanwhile, back at Google's global headquarters, the internal staff response was unlike anything Sundar had ever seen. Emails poured in from employees around the world, engineers, interns, HR leads, janitors, all writing to say how his message had impacted them personally. A janitor from the London campus wrote, "I've always walked quietly in your building, but now I walk with a little more pride, knowing our leader doesn't need to shout to be heard." In response, Sundar wrote a rare internal note to all employees, not to clarify the event, but to elevate the lesson. Leadership doesn't always come in press releases or shareholder meetings. Sometimes it comes in how we choose to treat people when no one is looking. And sometimes the greatest strength we can show is not in our reaction, but in our restraint. That email, like everything else he had done, didn't go viral. But it changed something inside Google. Teams began speaking more openly about ethical leadership. Diversity discussions moved from checkboxes to culture. Junior employees began sharing stories of exclusion and silence. And in that, Sundar saw his greatest achievement, not the applause from Geneva, but the courage his silence had sparked in others. As the storm began to calm and the media cycles shifted toward newer controversies, Sundar returned to his work. With renewed clarity, he didn't address the handshake again. He didn't need to. The world had already done what it was meant to do: interpret, amplify, critique, and eventually forget. But in a quiet village in Tamil Nadu, an old woman who had once walked miles to get groceries watched a replay of the speech on a borrowed smartphone. She had never been to Geneva. She didn't understand artificial intelligence. She had never owned a computer. But as she watched her son speak with a voice full of dignity and peace, her eyes filled with quiet tears, because she knew Not every response needs a sound. Some truths are felt. Some victories don't need headlines. The heat of Chennai pressed softly against the tinted windows of the black sedan as it weaved through narrow lanes lined with scooters, street stalls, and the cacophony of a city in perpetual motion. The scent of jasmine, diesel, and frying lentils floated through the air, grounding everything in a kind of familiarity that only one's birthplace can provide. Sundar Pichai sat quietly in the back seat, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his gaze not on the phone screen in front of him, but on the world outside. A world he once walked through as a boy with dusty shoes, carrying school books wrapped in old newspapers. It had been over a year since he had last returned to Chennai, his schedule overflowing with shareholder meetings, policy forums, and global interviews, rarely allowed for more than short, symbolic visits. But this trip was different. It was not announced to the press. It was not coordinated with political leaders or covered by PR handlers. It was personal. A quiet retreat in the shadow of a public storm. After the Geneva incident and the speech that followed, the world had reacted with intensity, but Sundar had chosen to respond by doing what he always did, retreating into reflection, into action, away from the noise. The car turned into a narrow street that hadn't changed in years. His childhood home, a modest two-bedroom apartment above a scooter repair shop, stood with its fading yellow paint and rusted window grills. No fanfare greeted him, no waiting photographers or bodyguards. Just his mother standing barefoot in the doorway, wearing the same cotton sari she wore every summer, her face aglow not with pride, but with the simple joy of seeing her son again. They didn't talk about Geneva. They didn't talk about politics. Instead, she asked if he'd eaten, whether the AC in the guest room was working, and if he'd brought her the filter coffee from San Francisco she liked so much. He smiled, unpacked a small tin from his bag, and placed it in her palm. For a while they sat together on the veranda, sipping tea from steel tumblers, watching children play cricket in the street below. That evening, Sundar visited his old school, the government higher secondary school, where he had once sat on wooden benches, scratching formulas into the margins of his textbooks. He had requested a quiet meeting with the students, no speeches, no ceremony. But when he arrived, he was greeted by a classroom full of wide-eyed boys and girls, most of them sitting up straighter than usual, their eyes oscillating between awe and nervous excitement. One girl, barely 16, stood up timidly and asked, "Sir, when people treat you unfairly, how do you still remain calm?" Sundar didn't respond immediately. He looked out the window for a moment, where the tamarind tree he used to sit under still stretched its limbs toward the sky. "Because fairness," he said, turning back to her, "is not always given, but dignity. Dignity is something you never have to wait for someone else to give you. You carry it inside you." The room was silent, not because they didn't understand, but because they did. Afterward, the headmaster asked him to sign a few textbooks, and one boy, clutching his notebook to his chest, leaned in and whispered, "Sir, thank you for showing us that being kind isn't weakness." Later that night, Sundar stood alone on the rooftop of his family home, looking out over the flickering lights of the city. From that vantage point, he could see the soft contours of his past and the steel towers of the future rising around them. He thought not of Geneva, but of moments like this, quiet, grounded, unrecorded. But his visit, though personal, hadn't gone unnoticed. 2 days into the trip, a discreet message was delivered to his team from a senior official in the Indian government. It read simply, "An advisor from the PMO would like to meet informally, off record. If agreeable, they can arrange a neutral setting." Sundar considered it carefully. There was no grudge in him, no resentment, but also no desire to turn an honest moment into a diplomatic theatre. Still, he agreed. They met in the lounge of a small hotel near Marina Beach. No press, no entourage, just 2 men at a corner table. The advisor, A seasoned bureaucrat with kind eyes and a practiced calm extended a hand as they sat. "Thank you for agreeing to this, Mr. Pichai." Sundar nodded. "Of course. I appreciate the discretion." There was no small talk. The advisor got straight to the point. The Prime Minister wishes to convey that while protocol often dictates behavior in such public arenas, there was no intent to dismiss or disrespect you. The situation was dynamic. Sometimes moments move faster than intentions can catch them. Sundar nodded again, slowly, thoughtfully. "I understand," he said. "I've never asked for gestures, only space to do meaningful work. My respect for the office remains unchanged." The advisor studied him for a moment, then placed a small envelope on the table. "It's not official, but it's from him, in his own hand." Sundar didn't open it then. He waited until he returned to his room. There, beneath the soft yellow light of a modest desk lamp, he unsealed the envelope. "To the son of Chennai, whose silence was louder than applause. Some lessons must be learned in full view. You gave one to all of us. N.M." Sundar sat still for a long time. No triumph, no vindication, just the confirmation that sometimes, when the world tests your silence, it's listening more closely than you know. In the final days of his trip, Sundar visited a local foundation that supported rural students in science and technology. He spoke to volunteers, listened to students, and quietly pledged to fund a new lab in his father's name. No press release followed, no mention on his company blog, just a signature and a promise to keep opening doors others didn't see. As he boarded his return flight, looking down at the glowing lights of Chennai receding beneath the clouds, he carried no anger, no lingering bitterness. What he carried instead was clarity. That real change does not come from noise. It comes from choosing again and again to be rooted in something deeper than power, principle, and that was enough. Not all revolutions begin with banners and battle cries. Some start with a sentence, others with a gesture. And then there are those that begin with nothing, no words, no headlines, no victory parades, just one man choosing composure over reaction. In the weeks following Sundar Pichai's return from Geneva and his discreet visit to Chennai, the world around him continued on its surface path. Meetings resumed, policies churned, media cycles moved on, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. It wasn't visible like a movement, nor viral like a meme. It was quiet, consistent, and quietly profound. It was the revolution of restraint. Inside corporate boardrooms, across universities, in small discussion circles and within large bureaucratic institutions, Sundar's now legendary moment had begun to morph, not into a debate or a story of offense, but into a blueprint, not for diplomacy, not even for leadership in the traditional sense, but for a more subtle and overlooked quality, moral presence. And that idea began to take root in unlikely places. At the World Bank headquarters in Washington, D.C., a leadership roundtable was convened to discuss organizational reform and communication culture. What began as a standard conversation around strategic planning took an unexpected turn when one of the directors, an older man known more for numbers than nuance, set down his talking points and opened his remarks with a sentence no one expected. To hear from him, I watched a man stand with his hand unshaken and still lift the room with grace, he said. And I've come to realize that many of us here, myself included, have mistaken authority for respect and performance for influence. The room paused. He went on to speak candidly about the pressures he had faced to assert dominance in meetings, the urge to correct subordinates publicly, the politics of ego in leadership, and how, watching Sundar Pichai's moment at Geneva, he felt a sense of shame, not because he had ever been humiliated in public, but because he realized how often he had needed to be seen winning. He closed by stating that effective immediately, His team would be rebuilding its mentorship and feedback model, not around performance metrics alone, but around behavioral reflection and emotional intelligence. Across the world in Japan, a major university introduced a new leadership ethics seminar for its engineering students. The opening lecture, a video breakdown and group discussion of Sundar's Geneva speech. Students were encouraged not only to analyze what he said, but to examine what he didn't say, and how that restraint carried more weight than any retort ever could. In South Africa, a non-profit adapted the speech into a workbook for high schoolers. And in a growing number of online forums, young entrepreneurs began citing Pichai's posture as a framework for decision-making in crisis moments. And yet, as all this was unfolding, Sundar remained curiously absent from the center of it. Back at Google, he returned to business quietly. He resumed his schedule of internal reviews, tech briefings, and quarterly planning. He did not seek to capitalize on the cultural wave he had unintentionally created. He didn't post threads or share filtered photos of Chennai's dusty lanes, or inspirational captions about humility. He let the world speak while he simply worked. In fact, when one of his team members suggested launching an internal campaign around values-based leadership, using Geneva as a case study to highlight Sundar's approach, he politely declined. If our values need marketing, then they weren't values to begin with, he said softly, with a half-smile. But the story didn't need his permission to spread. People had already taken it and made it their own. One of the most surprising ripple effects came from an unlikely source, a coalition of youth-led startups in India who began reaching out to one another after reading Mira's viral blog post, the one titled "Not Every Response Needs a Sound." Dozens of small founders across Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, young men and women in places like Nagpur, Madurai, Ranchi, and Bhubaneswar, formed a network where they shared stories not just about investment and growth, but about values, responsibility, and decision-making under pressure. They called it the Echo Circle, referencing the idea that true influence echoes long after the applause fades. The network grew organically. No branding, no apps. Just shared Google Docs, Telegram groups, and Zoom circles where people could talk about what they had learned from moments of restraint. Eventually, they began inviting guest speakers, not influencers or celebrities, but teachers, mentors, even janitors who had quietly shaped their communities. One of their earliest speakers, Mira, she joined a session from her modest dormitory in San Jose, wearing an oversized hoodie, her hair pulled into a loose bun, her voice still trembling with nerves when she spoke. But what she shared that day, how Sundar's choice to say, "Less," taught her to mean more, became one of the most quoted moments in the network's archives. Her words were scribbled down, turned into posters, added to slide decks, and yet Sundar never once appeared in any of the sessions. He was never tagged, never quoted directly, because in many ways, his greatest act of leadership had been stepping back, allowing others to build something from a moment he had never intended to be heroic. Meanwhile, another development was underway, one that would reach Sundar only through second-hand whispers. A group of education reformers from Kerala, deeply moved by both his speech and his personal story, began designing a national mentorship pilot program for underserved students in STEM fields. Their vision was bold: to match high-potential students from underfunded schools with working professionals from tech, engineering, and academia. They decided to name the initiative the SP Fellowship, not for Sundar Pichai by name, but for the initials that now, to many of them, symbolized silent power. When asked why they didn't seek his endorsement or involvement, one of the founders replied in an interview, "He already gave us the model. He doesn't need to be in the room. The idea is already doing its work." It was perhaps the most fitting tribute to a man who had made silence speak louder than slogans. One evening, Sundar found himself on a walk through a wooded trail outside Mountain View, his usual routine to decompress from the unrelenting rhythms of Silicon Valley. A light mist clung to the trees. His phone buzzed. It was an email from a junior product engineer at Google India, who had been with the company only 3 months. The subject line read, "I didn't think I mattered until I saw you choose silence." The message was raw, honest. The engineer had struggled with self-worth, with imposter syndrome, with the quiet belief that unless he shouted he wouldn't be noticed. But after watching Sundar's Geneva moment, he began practicing a new habit. In every meeting, instead of trying to speak first, he chose to listen first. He began to find meaning in preparation instead of performance, and slowly, others began to turn to him not for charisma, but for clarity. At the end of the email he wrote, "Thank you for proving that restraint isn't weakness, that dignity doesn't require dominance." Sundar closed the email, stood still among the pines, and let out a slow breath. He didn't respond right away. He didn't add it to any speech or report. But in that moment, he realized that this was the legacy he was building. Not the shares or the titles, not the IPOs or patents, but the subtle, almost invisible shift in how people chose to carry themselves after watching him endure a moment of quiet trial with quiet grace. And perhaps that was the most powerful thing he had ever created, not a product, but a principle. Leadership at its core is not measured in words said when the room is quiet, or in how elegantly a person speaks to a microphone. It is revealed when pressure collides with principle, when the cost of staying ethical is tangible, and when those who follow are watching not just for inspiration, but for instruction. Sundar Pichai knew this. He had known it ever since his early days at Google, when he first began shaping products like Chrome and Android, where the stakes were technical, but the consequences philosophical. But nothing, not Geneva, not Silicon Valley's swirl of adoration, not even years of disciplined humility, could prepare him for the decision that now stood before him. A firestorm born not of his own doing, but one that would demand the full weight of his values to quell. It began, as these things often do, with a leak. Late one night, an internal document from a senior product team was circulated to major tech reporters. The file contained a confidential design brief for a government-backed AI surveillance program in a developing country, using advanced Google architecture. The contents revealed not just prototype models, but early talks between executives and that country's defense ministry. The nation in question had a troubling human rights record. The implications were explosive. Within hours, the media latched. "On Google enabling oppression," blared one headline. "Has ethics lost to enterprise?" read another. Tech journalists, social advocates and rival platforms took to social media demanding answers. The phrase, "do the right thing," a twist on Google's original motto, trended globally within hours. Internally, Google's employee networks were in disarray. Memos flew back and forth. Anonymous comments flooded forums. Some staff threatened walkouts. Others defended the company's innovation mission. The board remained tight-lipped, awaiting leadership's official position. Sundar, who had been in a meeting in Zurich when the leak hit, read the details in stunned silence. He had been aware of government inquiries in various countries regarding AI support for infrastructure and education. But this covert agreement, the potential misuse of Google's neural patterning systems for real-time citizen surveillance, went against every ethical guardrail he had championed for years. The immediate reaction from his legal team was cautious. "We're still technically in compliance," said one counsel. "The framework is experimental. No deployment yet. The wording allows interpretive flexibility. We can wait before speaking." But Sundar didn't wait. Within hours, he called an emergency all-hands video meeting, inviting over 1,700 core engineers, managers and product leads to join live. It wasn't a speech crafted for comfort, it was an address designed to confront. He began without slides, no corporate decor, just a dim office, a tired face, and a steady voice. "Today, we face something more serious than a PR issue," he said. "This is not about contracts. This is about conscience." He didn't cast blame. He didn't fire scapegoats. Instead, he laid out the core question plainly. What does it mean to create technology that serves society, not just sells to it? He reminded them that every AI model carried the fingerprints of its makers, not just the engineers, but the intentions behind the code. He referenced Geneva, not to relive a moment of restraint, but to contextualize it. "I chose silence then," he said, "because I believed the message would rise from it. Today, I cannot be silent, because now the silence would cost lives." Then he said the words that would shape Google's next decade. "We will not proceed with this partnership, effective immediately. We are withdrawing from any agreement that compromises our ethical AI charter, regardless of commercial impact." There was a pause. Then the screen began to fill with hundreds of quiet claps. Not emojis, not likes, just the sound of fingers against desks, people alone in their home. Offices letting that decision wash over them. The following days brought fury. Investors panicked over the abandoned deal. Government partners in that country issued veiled threats. Some board members privately questioned Sundar's willingness to forfeit geostrategic opportunities. Market analysts debated whether Google was losing its edge, becoming too idealistic. But outside the financial press, something else was happening. Ethics departments at other tech companies began referencing the decision as a watermark. Harvard Business School revised their fall syllabus to include a case study titled "Ethical Defiance in Modern Tech, the Pichai Doctrine." Activist groups who had once protested outside Googleplex sent letters of acknowledgement. Even in nations where government surveillance was normalized, underground networks used the moment as leverage to push for legislative change. And Sundar, he refused to treat the moment as a victory, because for him, it wasn't. It was a correction, a reckoning, a reminder that restraint wasn't just a virtue for public moments, it was a policy, a standard, a guiding framework for how power must handle temptation. 1 week later, at a closed-door summit hosted by the United Nations on digital ethics in vulnerable societies, Sundar was invited to speak, informally, without cameras. The audience wasn't full of techies or executives. It was filled with human rights activists, policy drafters, and a few world leaders who rarely mingled in such quiet rooms. Sundar sat in a circle of 15 people, no podium between them, no title cards in front, just voices. When it was his turn, he told a story. He spoke not about Google, but about his grandmother who once told him, "The truest test of a man is whether he stands up when no one is clapping." He paused, then added softly, "The hardest thing isn't building technology, it's knowing when not to use it." A woman from a war-affected region in West Africa, whose organization had been targeted by similar AI surveillance systems, looked at him with cautious eyes. "And if your competitors don't make the same choice?" she asked. Sundar didn't. "Blink, then I hope our users will." And perhaps that was the most radical thing he said all week, that ethics, when consistently applied, don't just inspire, they build pressure. Pressure on rivals, on markets, on governments, not through protest, but through precedent. The message slowly took hold. In the months that followed, 2 other tech companies quietly pulled back on similar international deals. A few claimed it was due to operational feasibility, but insiders knew the truth. Sundar had drawn a line in the sand, and others, whether out of fear or conviction, began following. One day, a journalist asked him at a press event whether He felt the moral burden of being the conscience of the tech world. Sundar replied with a dry smile. "No," he said. "I feel the burden of being human. That's enough." That night, as he walked through the quiet halls of Google's headquarters, long after most lights were off, he passed a bulletin board where interns sometimes posted quotes, cartoons, or notes of encouragement. A fresh, sticky note caught his eye. In simple black marker it read, "He chose silence at Geneva. He chose voice for us. Thank you." There was no name, no title, just a note. And Sundar knew, with all the noise in the world, the quiet ones were still listening. There comes a moment in every leader's journey when the noise fades, not because it is silenced, but because it no longer matters. Fame may rise and fall. Power may come and go. But what remains always is the trace a person leaves in the lives of others, not in their headlines, but in their habits, not in their speeches, but in the way others begin to speak. For Sundar Pichai, that moment arrived not in a conference room or corporate event, but in a small community centre tucked away in an overlooked suburb of Bangalore, where a dusty projector flickered quietly in front of 20 schoolchildren, unaware they were sitting inside a ripple he had once created. The room wasn't glamorous. Cracked ceiling fans turned lazily. The smell of turmeric from a nearby kitchen drifted in and mixed with the stale air of chalk dust and plastic chairs. On screen, a video played, grainy but clear, of a younger Sundar standing at the Geneva summit. He wasn't speaking yet. The frame had frozen on that now famous moment, his extended hand, his calm eyes, the moment when silence began to echo. A volunteer paused the video and turned to the children. "Do you know who this is?" she asked. One boy raised his hand. "Google, uncle." The room laughed, but what followed was not a tech tutorial or biography. It was a discussion about courage, about knowing when to speak and when to hold still, about leadership that doesn't shout. And the children listened, not because they knew Sundar Pichai's resume, but because something in that posture, that pause, had entered the public memory as a symbol, a lesson, a landmark. What made the moment so powerful wasn't that Sundar had intended for it to teach. It was that he hadn't, and still it had. That is legacy, the way one man's principles, when lived consistently, begin to shape the principles of others, even strangers, even children. Back in Mountain View, Sundar sat in a quiet corner of Google's campus under the shade of a flowering jacaranda. It had become a routine, late afternoons spent walking without his phone, without any meeting agenda. Not because he had retired from action, but because he had evolved into something deeper, a steward of culture, a keeper of moral infrastructure. The internal programs inspired by his ethical stance had begun to multiply. Young employees started ethics labs within Google, spaces where product decisions were debated with both technological and societal lenses. The Echo Circle startup movement that had been inspired by Mira's essay had now grown into an official fellowship program with chapters across 5 countries. Quietly, Sundar funded it, never attending the events, never asking for credit, but ensuring the platform had everything it needed to survive without his shadow. And then came an unexpected letter. It was handwritten, delivered in a plain envelope, addressed simply to Mr. Pichai, Google Campus, California. Inside was a short message in looping, careful cursive. "Dear Sir, I am Mira. You do not know me, but I know you, not from newspapers, not from speeches, but from a moment when the world turned away and you stayed still. I now teach young girls how to lead, not just to speak well, but to listen better. And when they ask me who taught me, I tell them, a man I never met who chose principle when it was easier to perform. Thank you." M. He read it once, then again. And then he placed it in his desk drawer, not beside his awards or press clippings, but alongside a stack of old engineering notebooks from his college days in Chennai. Because in that letter, he saw not admiration, but continuation, proof that the story he had started had moved on without him, grown its own roots, its own branches, and would now bloom far beyond his reach. Some weeks later, at a global education forum in London, Sundar was invited as a surprise guest to close the event. The forum was about learning systems, but the organizer introduced him differently. "We often think of learning as what we get from school," she said. "But sometimes, learning comes from how someone reacts to the hardest thing they've never prepared for." Please welcome Sundar Pichai, not just the CEO of Google, but the author of one of the finest moments of restraint our generation has ever witnessed. He walked to the stage, not with applause in his ears, but with reflection in his heart. He began not with data or predictions. He began with a story. "I was once a boy in Chennai who didn't speak much," he said. "People mistook that for weakness. Later, I became a man in Silicon Valley who still didn't speak loudly. Some still mistook it for weakness. Then one day, I didn't respond when the world expected me to, and people finally called it strength." The room held its breath. But I didn't stand still at Geneva because I knew it would inspire anyone. I stood still because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. That's the thing about integrity. It's not loud. It's private. It lives in the quiet between choices, and if you nurture it long enough, it starts speaking for you. He closed with a simple hope. May we all live in such a way that one day someone who never met us feels moved to act because of something we didn't say. The hall stood, not for applause, but in silent gratitude. That night, as he flew home, he looked out the window and saw a world glittering beneath him, a world full of noise, full of speed, full of people chasing headlines. And yet, somewhere down there, a girl was refusing to yell because she had learned silence could carry wisdom. A boy was listening before reacting. A leader was reconsidering power not as control, but as care. And Sundar smiled, not for himself, but for them, because this, finally, was the legacy he had worked for. Not innovation, not domination, but demonstration. A quiet example of what it meant to lead, not just when everyone is watching, but when no one is.